Thank you, Dominique. Thank you for all of you to have come to listen to this session. I'm a criminologist, but I was a lawyer, I studied law, and then I drifted towards criminology. And I will talk here from a criminological perspective, asking me what brought carceral geography to my approaches of prison. Criminology may pay attention to space while studying prison. It happens, but it's not the main approach of prison. And geography has studied the prison sometimes, but not so often. And often geographers stop at the gates of the prisons and don't enter it. But I don't think that till today they really influenced each other. I mean that criminologists don't know a lot of things about geography, don't pay too much attention to space, and on the reverse, I think that geographers often ignore prisons, often, not always. So my question is, how did carceral geography approaches modify my vision of prison? So I will talk about my work, trying to show how I tried to combine a criminological approach and a more space-centered approach. I wouldn't dare to say a geographical approach, since I'm not a geographer. My research is at a crossroad between a reflection on the legitimacy of prison and a reflection on mobility and social norms. So I'm working on the legitimation of prison, which has always been a burden for democracies. It has always been difficult to justify why we could put people in prison in a free society, praising the freedom of movement, praising the equality of all citizens. So it has always been a problem for us, and it's a labor of Sisyphus. It's always to be reconceived again, because it never works. It's a problem because we think about new legitimacies, and then it's obvious that it doesn't work, and then we have to invent something else. And my question was, how could we today justify prison, knowing that it's most of the time, if not every time, unsuccessful? And how could we do this knowing what happened in the last centuries? And my way of entering this field was to study the Belgian penitentiary law and more the parliamentary documents, because they are really abundant. There are more than 1,000 pages discussions about this. And my reflection was, this is an interesting public discourse about prison, trying to sketch a new prison that would be legitimate. I don't say that it will become a reality, and this law from 2005 is still not totally applicable. On the other side, I'm working with a colleague, sociologist of mobility, about the place of mobility in today's social norms. We are working on social representations of time, space, and mobility, trying to understand why mobility today is so important in discourses, why we so often use mobility to legitimate things as changes in social fields, family, work, urbanism, and so on. We developed a reflection about what we call the mobilitarian ideal, which is the way I think we could formalize the imperative of being mobile today. I must insist on a point, on the fact that in our work we consider that space is not only material. For us as sociologists, we consider that a space is not only a way of structuring the material reality, but it's also a way of structuring social realities. When and it has been a tradition in sociology because we have spoken about fields and we have used a lot of metaphors and so on, just to try to describe the social realities. And when we talk in sociology about proximity, it's not only a physical one, it can also be a social one, an ideological one, and so on. This is quite important for what will follow. I will talk here about social discourses and norms, not about practices, and I think we should listen to Olivier's intervention to have a better look at practices. So the idea is that the classical prison was an immobilizing dispositif. This is not a surprise for you. It's an isolated prison behind its walls. It's a compartmentalized prison which is cut into small pieces, cells and so on, to prevent circulations and communications inside. And as space is not only material, we can also say that it's a segmented social space. Everything is made to prevent the creation of social relationships inside the prison, but also everything is made to cut social relationships between the inmates and the outside. Their social network is thought as criminogenic, so they have to be cut from it. There is also a distinct legal regime, and we can also think about this in terms of space. It's a way of creating another group of norms which are highly derogatory to the common law. So these people live in a different space, or are meant to live in a different space, physically, socially, juridically, and so on. This matches with, miracle, it matches, with one of our, I don't remember the term in English, sorry, 1 second. Spatio-temporal morphologies, which means conceptions, social representations of time and space that matches. It's a way developed in the 19th century. I'm sorry, it's quite difficult because it's really theoretical and I only have 7 minutes left. It's a vision of space-time that relies on the idea of borders. The space that appears to be unstructured initially has to be structured and will be through borders. Borders between classes, borders between states, borders within the inside, between the inside and the outside of the prison, between the group of the inmates and the group of the rest of the citizens, and so on. So in this way of thinking about space-time, time is really constant because you cannot trace a border without stability. And so suddenly the border may change as an inmate one day may go outside of the prison and yesterday he was an inmate and today is just a normal citizen. So this brutality of transitions is really important in the way prison was conceived in the classical age of the prison, I would say in the 19th century. But it has changed, and in the discourses developed in the parliamentary documents of the Belgian penitentiary law, we can see a totally different vision of what prison is or of what prison should be to be legitimate. First, liberty deprivation outside of the walls of the prison is really important. They explicitly say that there is no more exclusivity of prison. So it isn't anymore a prison sentence. You are sentenced to liberty deprivation, freedom deprivation, but not necessarily inside a prison. Detention is clearly described as a preparation for the liberation. So it's not a time that is put out of your life. It's just a process which is thought in aiming at deliberation. That's quite a paradox to deprive someone from his liberty just to be able to liberate him after a certain time. There is also a strong discourse about a normalized prison, citizenship, opening, visits, community regime inside the prison. So this is very different from the vision that used to be the official vision before, and it shows also a prison that should become normal. You shouldn't be able to distinguish the inside from the outside. And this is also a way of weakening the border between the prison and the outside world. But more to this is also the development of compulsory mobilities. I mean, when you enter the prison, you have to write down a detention plan, to be active and to make a project inside the prison. It's not the purpose is not that you just sit in your cell and wait for 10 years for the day to go out. It's just that you have to be active yourself. You have to aim at your liberation and to be active to make it. When you go out, electronic monitoring is also another way of being not inside prison, but in the process of accomplishing your term. So the prison here is not no more, or not anymore. No, I wouldn't say that, but the importance of the border is really weakening, and what we see is the emergence of the idea that the prison is just a crossroad. A crossroad for prisoners, for people who have trajectories that come from the outside. They will pass through the prison, but after that there will be electronic monitoring, probation, and then social services, and so on and so on. So the incarceration is not anymore being put outside of the normal society in a very derogatory place. It's about just trying to manage your social trajectory, which is really different than the previous conception of prison. But if I said that space is not only material, I should consider this more carefully. Because if we try to look at the different spaces that are at stake in prison, we see that prison has always been a mix of immobility and mobility. Because the classical prison is certainly a physical immobilization, but it causes a social, a familial, a professional mobility. Because when you enter the prison, you lose your bonds with the outside world. So you enter in a declining social trajectory. So it's not, if you take it seriously and say, okay, space can be something else than just the physical reality, then you have to admit that prison is not only about immobility, it's also about mobility. For instance, one of the main goals of prison is to relocate the inmate after his liberation inside the society by discipline, by trying to cut him from his previous social relationships. You try to give him a new place in the prison, and this is also a sort of mobility. In the contemporary prison, we have seen that there are attempts to preserve the mobility. For instance, electronic monitoring is a way of allowing the inmate, which is not really an inmate, the monitored, to continue to circulate in a society. We have seen that the detention plan is a way of trying to put the inmate in movement. But on the contrary, why do we try to preserve the physical mobility through electronic monitoring? to preserve a social, familial, or professional immobility, to prevent them from losing their apartment, their family, their job, and so on. So, if the prison becomes normal, if it loses its exclusivity, if mobility constraints develop inside and outside of the walls, if mobilization and immobilization are combined, then how could we define prison? Should we still talk about prison? And in French, this is really strong because the term prison is quite unique. There are no so much different ways of talking about the prison. And when you talk about the prison, it's the prison, the penalty, it's also the building. So you cannot say about, you cannot really tell about what we are talking about. Are we talking about the building or about the punishment and all the organization? So shouldn't we rethink the prison as the carceral, as it was suggested in a previous Carceral Geography conference, which was really interesting? And shouldn't we define it as a system of mixed techniques of mobility and immobility controls, electronic monitoring, but also bars, GPS systems, exclusion of zones in the cities, and so on, aiming at a trajectory control, social and not only physical. And if you think about alternatives to prison and classical penalties, such as victim offender mediation and so on, this imaginary of just taking another way, making a path together to evolve and to make our environment evolve, I think you can admit that this is a strong another way of thinking about what the consequences of delinquency should be. But this carceral, as I try to call it, it should not be centered on the prison building, because if we do so, we won't see the whole environment. So, in conclusion, I think that carceral geography is an occasion of dialogue between disciplines about a common field. And I see carceral geography more as a field than as a discipline, a field where a lot of disciplines are welcome. But no discipline should remain unchanged by this contact. Because if we move from the prison to the carceral, it means a lot for criminology. But if we also admit that space can be something else than just the physical reality, maybe it means also a lot for geography. Thank you.